Racist cop lunges at black woman, not knowing she's the architect of the reform blueprint built to dismantle him. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. And now, let's return to our main character. The room was designed to look neutral, but nothing about it felt fair. A municipal hearing chamber measured in quiet tension where polished wood and soft lighting masked years of unspoken imbalance. And at the center of it all stood Alyssa Carter, a black woman in her late 30s with a composed posture that suggested preparation rather than fear, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady. Her presence, unassuming to those who believed authority, announced itself loudly. She had arrived early, taken a seat near the back, and listened as names were called and procedures repeated, the routine of governance moving along as it always did, predictable, insulated, and comfortable for those accustomed to being believed. Across the room, Officer Daniel Brooks leaned against a railing with the ease of someone who had never been asked to question his place. His uniform crisp, his expression bored, his confidence rooted not in the law itself, but in how often it bent in his favor. When Alyssa rose to step forward, it was not an interruption, but a turn in the agenda. Yet the shift drew Brooks's attention like a challenge he hadn't consented to, his eyes narrowing as if the space itself had been misused. There was no announcement of who she was, no introduction that framed her importance. Only the quiet sound of her shoes crossing the floor and the low murmur of observers who assumed they already knew how this would go. Brooks moved quickly, a sharp step that carried more intent than necessity, his voice rising to assert control where none had been threatened, and the room froze in that familiar way where discomfort becomes permission. Alyssa stopped without flinching, not startled, not defensive, simply present, as though she had anticipated this exact moment and chosen it. Carefully, she did not raise her voice or her hands, did not reach for credentials or allies, because she understood something Brooks did not, that power reveals itself best when it doesn't rush. Around them, officials glanced at their papers, audience members shifted in their seats, and the air thickened with the expectation that she would explain herself, apologize, or retreat. She did none of those things. Alyssa had spent years studying how systems protect their own, how language can excuse behavior, how a single incident can be dismissed unless it fits into a pattern already documented and undeniable. She knew that what looked like a spontaneous confrontation was, in truth, a test of assumptions, and she allowed those assumptions to speak freely. Brooks mistook her calm for compliance, her silence for uncertainty. And in that misreading, he stepped closer to a line he had crossed many times before, convinced that consequences, like accountability, were for someone else. Alyssa met his gaze with a stillness that carried history, data, and intent, the kind that comes from drafting solutions rather than reacting to problems. And as the moment stretched, unseen by most in the room, the blueprint she had authored, the reforms debated in closed sessions, the policies waiting for the right proof, all began to align around him. He believed he was enforcing order, unaware that he had just placed himself at the center of a design meant to expose exactly what he represented. And while the room remained quiet, the story had already begun to move, not toward conflict, but toward a reckoning written long before either of them had walked through the door. The chamber settled into a rhythm that felt rehearsed, the kind of procedural calm that had absorbed countless moments like the one unfolding now. And as Alyssa Carter stood where she had been directed, the environment itself seemed to close ranks, polished desks aligned, microphones resting and used, flags unmoving in conditioned air, all of it reinforcing the idea that order already existed and did not require her input. Officer Daniel Brooks returned to his position with a faint look of satisfaction, convinced the moment had passed in his favor, unaware that moments did not disappear here. They accumulated, recorded not only in minutes and transcripts, but in memory, precedent, and pattern. The officials seated along the dais spoke in neutral tones, citing guidelines, time limits, and agenda items, their words carefully chosen to avoid friction. While Alyssa listened with the attentiveness of someone who understood system from the inside out, someone who had learned long ago that power rarely announced itself directly, but hid behind process and patience. This room was familiar to her, not because she had stood in it before, but because she had studied hundreds like it, measuring how decisions were delayed, how accountability was diluted, how behavior was reframed when authority felt threatened. Outside the chamber walls, the city moved at its usual pace, traffic lights cycling, office buildings filling with workers, lives continuing without any awareness that a quiet pivot point had been reached less than 10 miles from downtown. Brooks glanced at the clock mounted high on the wall, calculating how much longer this would take, confident that nothing here could alter the trajectory of his day, his week, or his career, because history had taught him that hearings ended, reports were filed, and the system absorbed discomfort without changing shape. Alyssa, however, marked time differently, not in minutes, but in sequences, in cause and effect, in how long it took for truth to move from paper to policy to consequence. She had spent years drafting language that looked harmless at first glance, paragraphs dense with legal clarity, clauses designed to remove discretion where it had been abused, frameworks that require transparency rather than trust, and every sentence she had written had been tested against scenarios just like this one. As the discussion shifted to public comment, murmurs rippled through the audience, some curious, some dismissive, many already assuming the outcome. And Alyssa felt the familiar weight of expectation pressing against her, the unspoken belief that she would either justify her presence or quietly step aside. She did neither. Her expression remained composed, not defiant, not submissive, simply resolved, as if she were standing at the center of a long equation, finally ready to be solved. Brooks watched her again, puzzled now, unsettled by the absence of reaction he had anticipated, because he had learned to read fear, irritation, and resistance, but not preparation. The chairperson called the next item. Voices resumed their steady cadence, and yet something subtle had shifted, a barely perceptible tension that suggested the room was no longer operating on autopilot. Alyssa understood that change never arrived with spectacle at first. It arrived with documentation, with alignment, with moments that seemed ordinary until they were revisited under a different lens. She took a measured breath, aware that I was either watching her or deliberately avoiding her. And in that quiet convergence of attention and denial, the foundation of a much larger reckoning continued to form, unnoticed by those who believed control was permanent and unchallenged by time. As the proceedings continued, attention drifted in predictable patterns, officials focusing on their prepared notes, observers checking phones, and Officer Daniel Brooks settling back into the confidence that came from believing he had already asserted control, yet Alyssa Carter remained fully present, tracking every exchange with the precision of someone who understood that institutions revealed themselves not in what they declared, but in what they tolerated. She listened as procedural language filled the chamber, phrases about oversight, community standards, and operational discretion spoken with practiced neutrality, and she recognized the familiar choreography, the way responsibility was distributed so thinly that no single hand appeared to hold it. Alyssa had learned early in her career that this diffusion was not accidental, but engineered, designed to ensure that when something went wrong, no one could say exactly where it had failed. Years earlier, long before this hearing had been scheduled, she had been invited into rooms where policies were shaped quietly, where the people at the table believed reform was a matter of optics rather than structure, and she had watched as good intentions dissolved under pressure from tradition. Instead of walking away, she had stayed, documenting patterns, mapping incentives, identifying the precise points where discretion became shield rather than tool. In the chamber now, her calm was not an act, but a discipline, the result of knowing that reaction would only confirm assumptions already made about her presence. Brooks glanced toward her again, unsettled by the sense that he was missing something, because he had expected frustration, perhaps embarrassment, something he could recognize and dismiss. But what he saw instead was patience, and patience made him uneasy. He shifted his weight, the faint creak of leather from his duty belt echoing in the otherwise controlled quiet. And for the first time that morning, he wondered why she had not spoken, why she had not tried to explain herself or appeal to the room. Alyssa understood that the system preferred explanations over evidence, stories over structure, because stories could be debated while structures required change. She had not come to tell a story. She had come to observe how the room behaved when confronted with its own reflection. As the chairperson acknowledged the next agenda item, a report on internal review processes, Alyssa noted the language carefully, the emphasis on compliance rather than outcomes, the reassurance that protocols existed without any discussion of whether they worked. This was the gap she had spent years addressing, translating lived experience in a policy architecture that could not be ignored or softened by interpretation. She had drafted requirements that tied authority to accountability, mechanisms that triggered automatic review rather than discretionary response, and safeguards that removed the burden of proof from those most affected. Brooks, unaware of the scope of what was unfolding, leaned toward a colleague and murmured a remark meant to signal that this was routine, that nothing here mattered beyond the hour. And Alyssa heard it without turning, filing it alongside countless similar dismissals she had encountered throughout her career. The room moved forward, but the balance within it had already shifted, subtle yet irreversible, because Alyssa had confirmed what she needed to see, how quickly authority closed ranks, how easily discomfort was normalized. She took another measured breath, steady and unhurried, knowing that systems rarely collapsed under confrontation, but often unraveled under their own recorded behavior. While Brooks believed this hearing would fade into memory by lunchtime, Alyssa understood that it would instead become a reference point, a documented example, one more thread woven into a framework designed to ensure that moments like this could no longer be dismissed as isolated or misunderstood. The chamber lights hummed softly overhead, indifferent to the significance of what was being set in motion, and as voices continued their procedural cadence, Alyssa remained exactly where she needed to be, watching, listening, and allowing the system to reveal itself completely. The tension that had been quietly building now surfaced in subtle but unmistakable ways, not through raised voices or overt confrontation, but through the tightening of expressions and the careful recalibration of tone as Officer Daniel Brooks began to feel the room slipping from his intuitive grasp. He stepped forward again under the pretense of procedural clarification, positioning himself closer to Alyssa Carter than necessary. His presence intended to remind everyone who enforced boundaries here, and the shift drew a ripple of attention that momentarily broke the chamber's practiced indifference. Brooks spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being deferred to, referencing protocol and order, his words framed as reminders rather than accusations, yet the implication was clear enough for those listening. Alyssa met this escalation without visible reaction, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, a quiet refusal to participate in the narrative he was attempting to impose. Around them, officials exchanged brief glances, some uncomfortable, others relieved that Brooks had taken control, because his intervention allowed them to remain passive observers rather than active decision-makers. The chairperson hesitated before responding, choosing language that neither endorsed nor corrected Brooks, and in that hesitation Alyssa recognized the familiar pattern of institutional avoidance, the instinct to preserve harmony even when imbalance was on full display. Brooks mistook this silence for validation and continued, his confidence growing with each unchallenged sentence. Convinced that the room was aligned with him, that Alyssa's restraint signaled concession rather than strategy. He gestured toward her as though summarizing an inconvenience, framing her presence as a disruption to the agenda rather than a participant within it, and a low murmur spread through the audience, curiosity blending with judgment. Alyssa remained composed, aware that this moment was precisely the type that revealed character under scrutiny, not just his but the system's, and she allowed the assumptions to solidify, knowing they would soon be measured against recorded reality. Brooks paused, expecting a response, an explanation, something that would justify his intervention, and when none came, irritation crept into his expression, a subtle crack in the certainty he had carried into the room. He shifted tactics, softening his tone slightly, presenting himself as reasonable, as someone merely maintaining standards, and this recalibration was not lost on Alyssa, who had seen it countless times, the pivot from dominance to decorum when authority sensed scrutiny. The officials at the dais nodded along, eager to move forward, eager to close this moment without acknowledging its significance, and in their eagerness they reinforced the very dynamics Alyssa had spent years documenting. She observed how quickly discomfort was reframed as inconvenience, how easily accountability was postponed in favor of efficiency, and she noted the timestamps, the phrasing, the sequence of responses, each detail fitting neatly into a framework already waiting to receive it. Brooks stepped back at last, satisfied that he had reasserted order, unaware that his behavior had been witnessed not just by those in the room, but by the mechanisms Alyssa had helped design, mechanisms that transformed moments like this into data points rather than anecdotes. The chairperson called for the session to proceed. Voices returned to their neutral cadence, and the audience settled, believing the disruption had passed, while Alyssa stood quietly at the center of it all, her silence heavy with implication. She did not need to speak to escalate the conflict, because the escalation had already occurred in the open, captured in the way authority reacted when it believed itself unobserved. As Brooks resumed his position, his confidence restored on the surface, a faint unease lingered beneath, an awareness he could not quite articulate, that something about this exchange would not resolve itself as neatly as others before it. Alyssa understood that public humiliation did not require spectacle, only exposure, and she allowed the room to move on, secure in the knowledge that every choice made in this moment had been noted, preserved, and positioned within a larger design that no longer depended on anyone's permission to advance. What remained after the surface tension settled was a quieter layer of activity that few in the chamber noticed. The subtle choreography of record-keeping and procedural routine where meaning was embedded not in speeches, but in documentation. And Alyssa Carter paid close attention to this layer, because it was where systems revealed their true priorities. As the session progressed, clerks annotated minutes with standardized language. Timestamps were logged, and references to policy sections were cited with casual familiarity, all of it appearing mundane to observers who assumed that paperwork was neutral rather than decisive. Alyssa watched how Officer Daniel Brooks's earlier intervention was summarized, not by describing what had occurred, but by reframing it as an operational clarification, a choice of words that quietly insulated authority while minimizing impact, and she noted the exact phrasing, aware that language was often the first line of defense against accountability. She adjusted her stance slightly, allowing the movement to register on the fixed cameras mounted near the ceiling. Not because she needed to be seen, but because she understood how records were reviewed later, how angles and timestamps could confirm presence and sequence without commentary. Brooks, for his part, resumed a posture of disengagement, occasionally checking his phone and exchanging muted remarks with colleagues, convinced that the earlier exchange had resolved itself in his favor, unaware that the administrative details accumulating around him were far more consequential than any reaction he might have provoked. Alyssa listened as references were made to internal audits, oversight committees, and compliance reviews, each mentioned with a tone that suggested reassurance rather than rigor, and she recognized the pattern she had spent years addressing, the reliance on process without measurement, on intention without enforcement. She recalled the late nights spent drafting provisions that required automatic triggers when specific behaviors occurred, mechanisms that removed interpretation from moments like this, ensuring that documentation alone could initiate review without the need for complaint or escalation. In this room, those mechanisms were still invisible, existing only as proposals and pilot programs discussed elsewhere, but the data they required was being generated in real time, shaped by the very assumptions Brooks and others took for granted. A staff member approached the dais to deliver supplemental materials. Folders passed hand to hand, and Alyssa noted how certain reports were prioritized while others were deferred, the order itself revealing which issues commanded attention and which were expected to fade. She observed how Brooks's name appeared casually in a discussion of departmental efficiency metrics, cited without context, without examination, and she marked the moment internally, recognizing it as another data point, another instance where reputation substituted for review. Alyssa had learned that systems rarely change because someone demanded they do so. They changed when evidence made an action untenable. She glanced briefly toward the public seating, noting the mixture of curiosity and detachment on faces that assumed this process belonged to someone else. And she understood why reform was often slow, because its early stages looked indistinguishable from routine governance. Brooks shifted in his seat again, a flicker of restlessness betraying a growing sense that the room was no longer entirely predictable. Yet he dismissed the feeling, attributing it to the length of the meeting rather than to any substantive shift. Alyssa remained still, her attention divided between the spoken agenda and the unspoken record forming beneath it, confident that what mattered most was not how this session would be remembered by those present, but how it would be reconstructed later through transcripts, footage, and procedural logs. The chamber continued its measured cadence, voices rising and falling with practiced neutrality, while beneath that calm, the groundwork for a different outcome took shape, one built not on confrontation or spectacle, but on the quiet accumulation of proof, aligned precisely with a blueprint designed to ensure that moments like this could no longer dissolve into ambiguity or denial. As the meeting approached its final stretch, Alyssa Carter allowed her focus to drift inward, not away from the room, but deeper into the sequence of decisions that had brought her there, because understanding the present required acknowledging how deliberately it had been constructed. Years earlier, she had been recruited not for visibility, but for precision, selected because she understood how reform failed when it relied on personalities rather than design, and she had accepted the role with the knowledge that success would mean remaining largely unknown. She remembered the first draft she had written, a dense framework outlining accountability triggers tied to specific behaviors rather than complaints, a model that assumed misconduct would be denied and therefore required proof to be automatic rather than requested. Those early drafts had been met with polite resistance, concerns about morale, flexibility, and tradition raised by people who spoke about balance while benefiting from imbalance. And Alyssa had responded by refining the language, tightening definitions, and embedding safeguards so quietly that they appeared administrative rather than transformative. In the chamber now, she watched as familiar objections surfaced in different forms, the same instincts dressed in new terminology, and she recognized how consistent the pattern remained across institutions. Officer Daniel Brooks stood as an unwitting embodiment of that pattern, his confidence resting on assumptions that reform had been designed to address, assumptions that authority would be deferred to, that context would excuse behavior, that discretion would always favor those who exercised it. Alyssa had studied profiles like his, not to vilify individuals, but to understand how systems elevated certain traits and shielded them from scrutiny, and she had ensured that the blueprint accounted for those dynamics without naming them directly. As officials wrapped up procedural items, Alyssa recalled the long hours spent translating lived experience into policy language that could survive legal challenge, language that did not accuse but required verification, that did not presume intent but measured impact. She had learned that the most effective reforms were the ones that felt inevitable once implemented, their logic difficult to argue against precisely because they removed emotion from the equation. Brooks glanced around as people began gathering their materials, sensing closure, relief evident in his posture as he prepared to leave the room behind, and Alyssa noted the ease with which he expected the moment to dissolve, unaware that dissolution was no longer possible. The mechanism she had helped design did not rely on memory or outrage. They relied on records, and everything necessary had already been captured. She remembered the briefing where she had explained that reform would not announce itself at the point of confrontation, but would surface later through audits, reviews, and automatic escalations that appeared procedural rather than punitive. In that vision, no single moment mattered on its own, but every moment mattered in accumulation. As chairs shifted and quiet conversations resumed, Alyssa remained where she was, her presence no longer drawing attention, yet anchoring the significance of what had transpired. She understood that the true reveal would not occur in this room. Not today, because the most enduring changes unfolded away from the spectacle of immediate reaction. Brooks stepped toward the exit, exchanging casual remarks with colleagues, convinced that his authority remained intact, and Alyssa observed him with a clarity shaped by years of preparation, knowing that his confidence was rooted in a version of the system that no longer existed in the form he believed. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as staff began their closing routine, and Alyssa took a final look around, not with satisfaction, but with resolve, aware that the blueprint she had authored was no longer theoretical. It was active now, fed by precisely the kind of unexamined behavior it had been built to dismantle. And while no announcement would be made today, the trajectory had shifted irrevocably, guided by design rather than chance. The shift became undeniable not through confrontation, but through recognition. The moment when alignment replaced assumption and the room, long emptied of its audience, began to echo with implications rather than voices. Alyssa Carter stood near the back as staff finalized their routines, her presence no longer incidental but quietly definitive, because the materials now circulating beyond the chamber carried her fingerprints in ways no one there could erase. Emails began moving within hours, flagged not as urgent, but as procedural, routed through compliance channels that had recently been updated, their language precise, unemotional, and difficult to dismiss. Officer Daniel Brooks, unaware of these movements, drove away from the building convinced the day had ended as most did, believing that familiarity equaled stability. Yet the system he relied upon had already begun to process his actions differently. Alyssa observed the early indicators from a distance, confirmations embedded in acknowledgments and receipt notices, the kind that meant review had been initiated without requiring complaint or escalation. This was the moment she had prepared for, not dramatic, not public, but structurally irreversible, because it transferred authority from individual discretion to documented process. She recalled explaining this phase during closed briefings, describing how reform succeeded when it felt administrative rather than adversarial, when accountability arrived disguised as routine. Brooks received a notification the following morning, brief and neutral, requesting clarification related to standard oversight measures, and he read it without alarm, assuming it was a formality, a box to check before returning to normal. He did not recognize the reference numbers or the updated policy codes cited in the message, because those elements had been finalized quietly months earlier, their implementation deliberately understated. Alyssa knew that realization would arrive later, when familiarity failed to protect him, when each response he provided generated further review rather than closure. As days passed, patterns emerged, subtle shifts in scheduling, inquiries framed as quality assurance, requests routed through independent channels rather than internal ones, and Brooks began to sense friction where there had previously been none. He mentioned it to colleagues, laughed it off, assured himself that experience would carry him through, yet confidence eroded as processes no longer bent toward reassurance. Alyssa remained largely invisible throughout this phase, by design, because the blueprint did not center her authority, it embedded it, ensuring outcomes did not depend on her presence or intervention. When Brooks finally asked who had authored the revised framework now governing his review, the answer arrived not as a name spoken aloud, but as a document header he had skimmed before, a policy he had never imagined would apply to him so directly. Alyssa watched this realization unfold through secondary channels, understanding that the most effective reveal was one that forced recognition without spectacle, that required those accustomed to control to confront the limits of their understanding. The system responded exactly as it had been designed to do, escalating based on criteria rather than emotion, creating a record that could not be softened by explanation or reputation. Brooks faced the uncomfortable clarity that his actions were no longer interpreted through familiarity, but measured against standards that did not know him personally and did not need to. Alyssa took no satisfaction in this moment, only confirmation, because the goal had never been to dismantle an individual, but to expose a structure that allowed certainty without accountability. As the process continued, she returned to her work, refining language, reviewing data, preparing for the next iteration, because reform did not end with one case, it advanced through repetition. The reveal was complete not when her role became known, but when the system functioned without requiring her acknowledgement, proving that the architecture she had built was strong enough to stand on its own. And in that quiet success, the balance of power shifted permanently from assumption to design. The consequences unfolded without spectacle, guided by procedure rather than outrage. And that distinction mattered because it removed any illusion that what followed was personal. Officer Daniel Brooks entered a phase of review that felt unfamiliar precisely because it did not mirror the informal resolutions he had grown accustomed to, the quiet conversations, the assurances, the shortcuts that once closed doors before they ever fully opened. This time, the doors remained open, not dramatically, but persistently, as requests for documentation arrived on fixed schedules. Interviews were conducted by individuals he did not recognize, and timelines extended beyond the limits of his patience. Each interaction was courteous, methodical, and grounded in policy language that offered no room for negotiation, and Brooks struggled to reconcile this tone with the authority he believed he still carried. Alyssa Carter followed the process only as far as necessary, reviewing aggregated reports and compliance summaries that confirmed the system was operating as intended, escalating where thresholds were met, pausing where verification was required, and advancing again without bias or urgency. She understood that this phase often felt anticlimactic to those expecting visible punishment, but she also knew it was where reform proved its durability, in the absence of applause or confrontation. Brooks attempted to contextualize his actions, providing explanations framed by experience and intent, yet each submission generated further questions rather than closure, because the framework measured impact rather than motivation. The realization unsettled him, not because he believed himself wrong, but because the criteria no longer aligned with his self-perception, and that misalignment eroded the confidence he had relied upon for years. Departments adjusted schedules quietly, responsibilities were redistributed temporarily, and oversight increased incrementally, each step justified by policy references that traced back to reforms he had never taken seriously. Alyssa recognized this pattern from previous implementations, the gradual recalibration that forced systems to adapt without dramatic rupture, ensuring continuity while correcting imbalance. Brooks began to notice the distance growing between himself and the institution he had once felt inseparable from. Colleagues more cautious, supervisors more reserved, interactions stripped of the familiarity that once insulated him. He searched for an advocate, someone who could explain what was happening, but found only process, and process did not argue or reassure. Alyssa reflected on the early criticisms of the blueprint, the warnings that such structures would feel impersonal, that they would remove discretion and trust, and she acknowledged the truth in those concerns, because reform often required discomfort to dismantle dependency on unchecked authority. The system continued its work, reviews progressing according to schedule, findings documented with precision, outcomes determined by criteria rather than consensus. Brooks received formal notice of adjustments to his standing, framed not as condemnation but as corrective action aligned with updated standards, and the language left little room for interpretation. There was no dramatic confrontation, no singular moment of collapse, only the steady narrowing of options that accompanied accountability enforced without exception. Alyssa did not celebrate this outcome, because the objective had never been to watch an individual fall, but to witness a structure hold, to confirm that the mechanism she had helped design could withstand scrutiny and pressure. As weeks passed, the process concluded not with a public statement, but with institutional changes that recalibrated expectations, signaling to others that behavior once tolerated would now be measured differently. Brooks faced the quiet understanding that his career trajectory had altered permanently, not because someone had targeted him, but because the environment he operated within no longer accommodated the assumptions he had depended on. Alyssa returned her attention to the broader landscape, reviewing data trends and implementation reports, satisfied not by the outcome itself, but by the integrity of the process, because true accountability did not announce itself loudly. It reshaped systems so thoroughly that future moments like this would unfold differently, guided by design rather than discretion. The story did not end with an announcement or a headline, because the most enduring changes rarely did, and Alyssa Carter understood that conclusion was less about resolution than continuity. In the months that followed, the framework she had helped build settled into place across departments and committees, not as a radical departure, but as a recalibration that quietly redefined expectations. Metrics shifted. Reviews became routine rather than exceptional. Behaviors once overlooked were now measured against standards that no longer depended on familiarity or discretion. Alyssa moved through her workdays without recognition from those affected most directly, and she preferred it that way because anonymity allowed the system to speak for itself without the distortion of personality. She reviewed quarterly summaries, noting trends that suggested early resistance giving way to adaptation, and she recognized the familiar arc of institutional change: discomfort followed by normalization, resistance followed by compliance. Officer Daniel Brooks, meanwhile, adjusted to a reality he had never anticipated, one where his actions carried weight beyond immediate context, and where certainty no longer protected him from review. He became more cautious, more reserved, aware that every decision now existed within a documented framework that did not forget or excuse. The absence of drama made this adjustment more difficult, because there was no single moment to point to, no confrontation to resent, only the steady presence of accountability shaping each interaction. Alyssa never crossed paths with him again, not because she avoided it, but because the architecture she had designed did not require her presence to function, and that independence marked its success. Across the city, similar adjustments unfolded quietly. Supervisors referencing updated guidelines, training sessions incorporating language that emphasized impact over intent, and oversight reports treated as integral rather than symbolic. Communities that had long expected disappointment began to notice subtle changes, not in rhetoric, but in response times, in documentation, in a willingness of systems to examine themselves without prompting. Alyssa knew these shifts would not satisfy everyone, because reform rarely delivered the emotional release people hoped for, but she also knew sustainability mattered more than spectacle. She returned often to the principle that had guided her work from the beginning, that justice did not require elevation of one individual over another, but correction of the structures that allowed imbalance to persist. As years passed, the blueprint evolved, refined by data and experience, its origins fading into institutional memory, which was exactly as intended. New professionals entered the system unaware of the moment in the chamber that had contributed to its activation, and Alyssa welcomed that, because it meant the framework had outgrown its inception. For Brooks, the lessons settled slowly, not as shame or regret, but as awareness that authority carried responsibility beyond assumption, and that systems could change without asking permission from those who once defined them. Alyssa continued her work, measured and methodical, content not with recognition, but with results, understanding that the truest form of justice echoed, not in applause, but in consistency. The chamber where it had begun returned to its routine rhythm, hosting new agendas and new faces, unaware of its role in a larger transformation. And Alyssa passed by it one afternoon without pause, confident that the law no longer depended on who enforced it most loudly, but on who had designed it to endure. He believed he enforced the law because it favored him, but she had rewritten the rules so that the law would finally favor fairness. And in that quiet recalibration, the balance of power shifted in a way that would outlast them both.